Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We're going to continue our talk on the Middle Ages, and we're going to jump into part two and start looking at the development of the church at this time. So, during the Middle Ages, we actually have a really big development in the church, and it's really going through a heavy time of reform. Where there's a lot of changes. And Christianity is becoming this massive power in Europe. And that's what we're going to take a look at now. So, as the church kind of grows stronger, it starts to create this hierarchy, this distinct look to it. And we start off with the Pope at the top, and then beneath him are his clergy, and the clergy actually includes everybody else. So that would be the bishops near him, the archbishops and the bishops at the top, the priests who are in charge of specific precincts, right? And then you have the monks and the friars, and the friars are typically just these homeless beggars that kind of move around from place to place, spreading Christianity. So you know, one of the big things is as time progresses, the church kind of pushes its way of thinking, its ideals, much harder onto the populations of Europe. And a lot of the medieval Christians relied on what are known as sacraments. And sacraments are these important religious ceremonies that occur. One of these is baptism. And they would typically push this onto people and say, okay, well, you have to do these sacraments, because if you don't, then you're not part of the Christian community. You're not a Christian. You are not going to be you're not going to be saved, right? So everybody had to follow these rules, and it wasn't only just the people, the peasants and the serfs and stuff. It was actually everybody. It was the Pope. It was the bishops. It was the priests. Everybody also part of that hierarchy. So everybody, the kings, the noblemen, the knights, they had to follow the law of the church, and this became known as canon law. And it was actually quite scary for a lot of people if they violated canon law. And the reason being is because a lot of times what could happen is that you could be considered excommunicated. So if you're excommunicated, then that means you're being denied salvation, and you're not gonna make it to heaven, right? And that's the last thing people want when their life completely revolves around Christianity, is to lose that ticket to heaven. So the church had a lot of power, and they certainly knew how to work with it. So we're going to continue on with this discussion, right? Now, this did cause a rift between the church and the powerful people, specifically the kings, right? The people that were in charge. And one of the main causes was actually known as lay investiture. So, a lay investiture is where kings actually appointed their own church officials. And this way, they actually gained a little bit of power within the church, because they could go to their people and say, the people that they appointed, and say, hey, why don't you do me this favor? And, in return, I could give you money, I could give you whatever you want. So, the church officials would typically go, okay, yeah, that sounds great. So obviously the church knew about this, and eventually it was banned by Pope Gregory the Seventh. This caused a rift. This caused some major problems, because now you had these, you already had these power struggles, but now you're kind of magnifying that, right? The power struggles that were caused between Pope and these kings, specifically German kings, is kind of what we're focusing on here. One example in particular was the German king Henry the Fourth, and Henry was actually excommunicated by Pope Gregory the Seventh, because he tried to remove him from his position. He tried to pull strings with bishops and other people, and the Pope found out about this, and he excommunicated Henry. And basically, Henry, being this very, very religious person, just like everybody else in Europe, was scared to death and was like, I'm really sorry I did that, and eventually, after days of begging, basically, Henry is forgiven, and he just kind of goes back, the head between his legs, basically. So Henry returns back to his kingdom, and this actually proves to be quite a big thing for the church. And the reason being is because the church just showed that they are more powerful than kings. So as a result, right, the church became the central power across Europe. Even kings would bow down to the Pope. So the Pope sees this potential. It sees that, wow, we are really powerful. Now what can we do with it, right? So the popes continue to reform the church and change things, and they want to restore kind of Christianity as what it should be and expand their power and authority even more. So they start to expand beyond kind of their boundaries and start collecting taxes and enforcing canon law among everybody. And of course, everybody's kind of terrified of violating that. So the church is finding their power for sure. Now, as a result of this growth in church power and authority, they actually adopt this new style of architecture during this time, and it's known as Gothic architecture, and it really shows with these new massive cathedrals that they're putting up. And if you look at the older style of architecture, it was very dark and damp, and there wasn't a whole lot of windows. Everything was blocky, and it just didn't look very good. And nobody wanted to go into these places because they were dark and dirty. But now the money was flowing in. The church was very powerful, and they were like, okay, what can we do to show our power? Right. So they build these giant cathedrals, which are very open in the middle. They have these huge glass windows, stained windows. And not only that, but they have these big towers that they appeared to reach all the way up into the heavens, and people were very intimidated by this. So you see these giant buildings being erected, and they're reaching up into the clouds. The stained glass windows are shining light all through this great big opening, and people are wowed by this experience. And not only that, but they're completely surrounded by sculptures and art and all these beautiful things. And basically, this was all intentional. It was actually meant to inspire the worshipers. It was meant to intimidate them with this magnificence of God. The church was basically saying, because of God, we now have this great building, and you should be in awe. And people were. So as the church continued to grow, right, their power and authority continues to grow. And they have these magnificent cathedrals. People start to become really religious, and they already have been, right? But that actually creates kind of this new category, the age of faith, right? Where people are willing to do anything and everything for Christianity. And one of those things was the Crusades. So you have a lot of these knights and noblemen that step up to try, and even kings, to try and prove themselves. So they want to spread Christianity, and not only that, but there's a lot of other potential that comes from this, and that is, you have a lot of these goals that deal with economic things, so expanding trade, social, right, building relationships, and political things too, as well as religious goals. So one of the big things that came out of the Crusades was the Christian liberation of the Holy Lands, and they really wanted to take Christianity back to the Holy Lands. And provide kind of an opening for Christians to be able to go there and worship, um, really to kind of take over to start off with. And that turned out to be kind of very difficult to do. They were successful in the First Crusade, multiple crusades later, not so successful, but eventually they kind of came to the conclusion like, okay, well, why don't we just let everybody in and everybody will be happy? But also, they had the opportunity now, since they had contact with a lot of Muslims and Jews in the area, they were able to expand trade a lot farther east. Um, Now, keep in mind that the Crusades didn't only happen in the Holy Land. Now, obviously, that's typically the main crusade that we think of is the traveling to the Holy Land over near Jerusalem, and trying to capture that city for Christianity. But in addition to that, you also have some crusades that are occurring elsewhere in Europe. And one of those is the Spanish Crusade. And really, the Spanish Crusade was, in turn, it was trying to flush out Muslims from Spain, because Spain at this point in time was heavily invaded by Muslims. So a lot of the Christian Spaniards didn't want the Muslims in their area. So their goal was to try and flush the Muslims out of Spain, and they actually used what was known as the Inquisition. So the Inquisition was actually held by a court held by the church to suppress something known as heresy. Now, in heresy, you have specific people. They're called heretics. And heretics were people whose religious beliefs actually differed from the church. So if you were Jewish, or if you were Muslim, or if you were some type of pagan, if you weren't Christian, then you could be found guilty. And in some cases, you were forced to convert to Christianity. And if you were, in many cases, if you were believed to be something else, they might torture you for a very long time. And in some cases, it could lead to death. They could burn you at the stake. There was all kinds of problems. So as a result, right, these crusades that are occurring, there was a lot of things that came from this. So you have a lot of effects, and one of them was that women had a more important role at home while the men were gone. So they were actually making decisions on behalf of their husbands that might be out on this expedition, or out at war. So women began to step up in the role at the estate, or at the manor, or wherever else they might be. We start to see this expansion of trade between Europe and Asia as well. In addition to this, since the Crusades were not very successful, this actually lessened the power of the Pope. So the church's power and authority started to diminish at this point. And then, because the popes are losing power, kings are going to increase power. And this is actually going to be a very important point a little bit later on when we start looking at things that are following, talking about monarchy and stuff following the Middle Ages, and towards the end of the Middle Ages, and which we'll probably return and take a look at that a little bit closer here later. So again, now that you have a lot of this trade that is occurring because of the Crusades, the economy is growing, right? So you have more people that are interested in taking on specific tasks, because you have a more influx of stuff that you didn't have before. So people can start building skills. So you have artisans, very skillful artisans and craftspeople that start to pop up. And because of that, you have guilds that are developed to help teach these skills to new people. And because of that, you now have this commercial revolution. Okay, a commercial revolution, where you have a lot of this trade and business kind of going on, and there's a lot of it. So because of this expansion of trade and businesses, and typically, the way that this is done is through fairs and festivals. So people are getting together and they're sharing all their goods and services. Now that you have people that are able to do things, they can provide service for people, and people that are trading with other people are bringing in a lot of goods. So they bring everything all together and they hold these fairs and these festivals where people can go and trade and have a great time. But basically, what this does is it helps expand that trade and business, and now you have more work available, which means that there's more money available, which means that there are other people that are gaining more power. Okay, and there are certainly people that are taking advantage of this. Now, another thing is that because you have all these people getting together a lot more often, people are becoming more interested in moving back into large towns and even small cities. So finally, multiple hundreds of years later, after the fall of Rome, where you had the collapse of cities, where people were flooding out into rural areas, into the countryside. Now they're moving back in because they have all of this stuff available to them once again. And obviously, this is going to change a lot of things. One of the big things that it actually changes is learning and knowledge. So, because of the trade with the Middle East, this introduces Europeans to a lot of information that they didn't have their hands on before. So, a lot of libraries that were found in the Far East or in the Middle East, and resources, mostly resources from traditional ideas like from the Greeks and the Romans. This creates a vast growing interest in a lot of new knowledge in a lot of areas such as science and philosophy and law and mathematics. And because of that new knowledge that's available, you have more improved technology in shipping, in navigation, and in weapons. So you have a lot of new technology that's starting to come around. One of them is the English longbow, which we'll get into a little bit later. So in addition to all of this knowledge and learning that's going on, universities are beginning to open up. So people are taking learning to a whole nother level and wanting to become experts in specific areas. On top of that, reading and writing starts to move back in. So literature starts to become more popular. More people are learning again to read and write. And this right here is not going to, and I apologize for me being in the way, this specific thing, more people were learning to read and write. This is not going to help the church one bit. All right. And eventually, this is going to lead us into the Renaissance, which we will get into here next. So, one of the other big things that occurs during this time is we talked about the church kind of losing power and authority because of the Crusades. The church ends up having this kind of division. And there's kind of a funny story that goes along with this, right? So, for centuries now, popes and kings have struggled for power one over the other, right? The kings are always trying to outdo the popes, and the popes are always trying to outdo the kings. But in 1300, we have Pope Boniface the Eighth, and he tries to enforce papal authority on kings, including one particular one, which is the French king Philip IV. So Philip did not like this idea one bit, and he decides that he's going to imprison Boniface. He's like, I'm going to take you to court over this. So he takes Boniface, he puts him in a cell. Eventually, Boniface is able to get some help. Someone helps him escape, and he dies shortly after, about a month later. And this does not help the view of the church, right? Partially because now the kings are like, we got you, because none of the popes now wanted to mess with King Philip or any of the other kings, as a matter of fact. right? They're like, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want to end up in some dark old dreary cell and then die. So the kings started to get their power back over the popes. So what happens is, now that Boniface is dead, the popes need to find a new, or sorry, the church needs to find a new pope, and they decide on this specific one, this French archbishop, and he actually moves in the process, right? He becomes pope, and they're like, "Oh, this guy's not very good at this. This is probably not a good idea." But it's too late, right? He's already the pope. In the process, this guy ends up taking the papacy, right? The pope position, and he moves it from Rome in Italy up to Avignon, France. So he moves the entire papacy to Avignon, France, because he's French, and he wants to rule from his home territory, and probably because the king wants him there. So what's going to happen is that the Italians are now really mad. They're like, this guy comes in, he's the new pope, okay, but he comes in and he moves the papacy to France, and they're like, what's going on? Why? I want a new pope. I want a new pope. And the church is like, okay, we'll give you a new pope. So they pretend that like the other guy doesn't even exist, and they're like, okay, we're going to give you an Italian pope. So Pope Urban walks in, and he's like, I'm the new pope, and I'm going to be here. I'm going to be your pope from Rome. All right, I'm the real pope now. And now you have two popes, right? The church has two popes. You have one in Rome and one in France, in Avignon. And everybody's confused. And this actually causes something known as the Great Schism, or the Great Division. So, in the Great Schism, or the Great Divide, right? This Great Division, it was a split in the church over who was the one true pope. And the French pope, right? You have the French pope who lived in Avignon, who's claiming that he's the pope. And then you have the Italian pope who lives in Rome, who's claiming he's the real pope. So what the church decides to do is they're going to go, okay, we're going to ignore both of you because, they're excommunicating each other and just arguing and babbling back and forth. We're going to get a new pope in. Yeah, let's just ignore these guys, and you're the new pope, right? So the church decides to elect a new pope to fix the problem. Is it fixed? Of course not. The new problem that shows up is that there are now 3 popes. All right. So now you have a guy in Rome, a guy in Avignon, and another guy in Rome. And they're all claiming to be the pope. And the church is like, I don't know what to do. Please help. So what happens is, let me move myself out of the way. So what happens is, now you have the Holy Roman Empire, right? They decide to step up. The king, right? He decides to come in and be like, I'm going to try and fix this, guys. All right. No worries. Holy Roman Empire forces all 3 popes to resign. They're like, this isn't going to work. We can't have 3 popes. You all need to step down. Surprisingly, they do. All right. All 3 popes step down. And they're like, okay, who's going to be the new pope? So the church finally elects a new single pope, and everything is fixed, right? The Great Schism is over, but because of this, the papacy is severely weakened. And the main point of this, the main purpose of that weakening, is really because the French are upset because they want their own pope. The Italians are upset because they want their own pope. And it's all a mess. Like the whole thing. So it doesn't work out for the papacy in the end. The church is kind of weakened because of it. And you have a lot of other problems going on as well. We will get into one of the last problems that's really going to kind of really cause a problem for the church in the next portion, in part 3. where we'll bring up the bubonic plague.